So the final speaker I want to introduce is another one of our fantastic social work faculty. Dr. Joanne Cacciatore is a globally recognized leader in the realm of dealing with trauma, and particularly trauma around the loss of a child. As I'm sure she will talk about, that this work is motivated by her own experience, and yet again, we have an individual whose research is deeply linked to action. And as well known as Joanne is as a researcher, perhaps she's better known, and her impact is greater through her creation and leadership of a nonprofit organization that has been an incredible resource for families dealing with grief. And if you look at the website for her foundation and see some of the comments of people that have found her as a resource, you will see what impact this work has, and how research and understanding a complex phenomenon better through that research can do so much to positively affect the lives of the people who are touched by Joanne's work. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Joanne Cacciatore to talk about her work on bereavement.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. I have the unenviable task of talking about something that clears out a room faster than sex trafficking and faster than violence, and that's traumatic death. So the name of the talk is Death and Grief, and why death and grief are necessary for life and joy. So my story began in 1994. This is the grave of my fourth child. Her death catapulted me into a dark abyss of despair, what Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, would call dread, existential dread. Every cell in my body hurt, from the tips of my hair to the tips of my toes. I lost a dangerous amount of weight, weighed barely 90 pounds, and was not sure that I was going to survive her death. I descended into a state of what I called temporary but necessary madness. Well, it looked like madness from the outside, but from the inside it made perfect sense. Because in what kind of world do children die? What parent can prepare him or herself to bury a child? There was no one there, very, very few resources for me and my 3 surviving children at the time. And I used to wake up in the middle of the night and go into my closet and close the door and put pillows underneath so the children wouldn't hear me crying. And I would cry, and I called 5 disconnected phone numbers looking for help. And I said, if I get through this, I promise that I'm going to make sure that no one else has to do this by themselves. So I embarked in a long journey, and I began a nonprofit organization 2 years after she died called the Miss Foundation. Dean Koppell told a little bit about that. And we serve about 1 million families a month, access our website. We have 27 online support groups. I did not know what I was getting into when I started it. I thought we would help a few people. Probably would not have done it because it would have been too terrifying for me. And I began to conduct research. I went back to school, got my PhD, and started researching in this field. So my whole life became researching, teaching, and practicing direct practice with families whose children were dying or had died. So I'm going to talk for a minute about teaching the class that I teach here at ASU on traumatic death. About 3 cohorts ago, I walked into the classroom and I was unpacking my books. And there were 2 students sitting in the front, and one of them said to the other, "That's Dr. Death." And I looked up and I said, "What did you expect?" And I think that's what she expected. See, the trouble with grief and the trouble about talking about death is that it's kind of a grim subject and it makes people kind of feel icky, right? I mean, we don't want to talk about death, and we sure don't want to talk about the death of our children. Those of you who don't have children, I promise you that your parents don't want to talk about your death. Ernest Becker said in The Denial of Death, to live fully is to live with an awareness of the rumble of terror that underlies everything. Death terrifies us. And so does grief, even more so. Because when we're confronted with someone whose existential suffering is so profound and so palpable, we can barely stand to be in their presence. The grief is so thick and so heavy that we must turn away because we fear that that grief will also kill us. And that's the trouble with grief. That's why I don't get invited to many parties, actually. However, there is a beauty to grief that I'd like to talk about for just a moment. I promise not to bore you with research, but this is a paper that was recently published called Braving Human Suffering, Death Education, and its relationship to empathy and mindfulness. So I looked at a few cohorts of my traumatic death course. We have over 200 students, and we did some pre and post evaluations, and what we found was a simple 5 intensive day course on traumatic death increased their capacity for empathy and for mindfulness. Do you know how important that is? Empathy, the ability to feel with someone else, the ability to enter a sacred space, even if it's painful, and take on the feelings of another willingly, being willing to bear witness to this intense pain. And mindfulness, this way of being in the world that we're fully present without judgment, fully accepting of what is in that moment, without trying to change it or cure it or fix it. Pretty profound. So the quantitative data were very interesting, but the qualitative data for me was even more fascinating. I just pulled a few random quotes from the qualitative data. This course changed my life. It made me a better person, a better partner, and a better parent. I only wished I'd have taken the course long ago. These teachings have brought me back alive. I cannot convey how thankful I am. I feel as if I can finally feel the air, sun, wind, and water. Wow. Sounds like maybe you do want to invite me to a party. I took the class because it fit my schedule. At least he or she was honest. What I didn't know was how this class would impact me in so many ways. I felt emotions I never knew I had. I felt broken open, oddly vulnerable but strong. I wish every person on earth could take a class just like this. So I'd like to introduce you to some of the families with whom I've recently worked. This is the grave of a little boy named Jacob. Jacob is a little Native American boy with a sensitive, tender spirit. His mother loved him more than she loved anything in the world. He was murdered by a family member. And now, this is her reality. Every day that she wants to see her son, she has to visit him here. And this is Katie and Zach. Katie and Zach were rear-ended on the freeway. Both of them died. Katie was a little hippie, anachronism, out of time. She loved animals. She hiked barefoot, just like me, and she didn't even know me. She had a heart of gold, and she loved her family more than anything. And Zach was a little surfer boy, blonde hair and blue eyes, but if he got out in the sun for a few days, boy, could that kid tan. When I work with Jacob's mom, when I work with Katie and Zach's parents, I go home and I cry. I cry because I'm human, and I cry because I love them, and I love their children. And it is a tragic privilege to serve these families. This is Ronan Sean. Ronan was diagnosed with neuroblastoma. This is what treatment did to Ronan. His mother had to watch in anguish as month after month after month they struggled to save his life. I went home. Guess what I did? I cried. And this is Charlotte. Charlotte was killed, was murdered in the Sandy Hook shootings. She was a spicy little girl. She loved dogs, collected stuffed dogs. She loved wearing her hair in piggies, and she had a mind like her engineer father. I went home and I cried. I cry every day, and I'm okay with that because I live a pretty full, big life too. I got an email from someone who was reading my blog. He was from Italy, and he says, all of this stuff about death and loss and kids dying and violence and all this stuff, and how do you live? Aren't you depressed? I act in love for these families, not fear, because it's this kind of civic love, it's relationships. That's what provides the space and the capacity for people to heal from such horror. There is no pill. There is no fix, there is no cure to this kind of trauma, to this kind of grief. The only thing we can do is to create space so that the love eventually re-inhabits that space alongside the grief. There's no annihilation of the grief. There's no extinction of the grief. And so no, I'm not depressed. I'm never depressed. I cry a lot, but I'm not depressed. And in fact, this work has made my life bigger, not smaller. So what I tried to explain to this Italian man in my response, I said, imagine a box of crayons. And some of the colors are dark and drab and gray. And some of the colors are bright and vibrant and so full of life. But the vibrant colors wouldn't be as vibrant if you didn't put them next to the gray color. And so I'm willing to fully inhabit that space of abysmal grief with people. And I'm willing to bear witness to their suffering and their pain. And then one day, I get to see them through into the bottom of the abyss where the glimmering coins shine. That's what the mystics knew. Throughout history, the mystics had a wisdom, a profound wisdom, a sagacity that's beyond the realm of the physical. They understood that beauty and pain, that grief and joy, that life and death coexist. They're very, very close, that they're not mutually exclusive. Look, this is a picture taken from my backyard. You have a rainbow in the middle of a storm. Nature teaches us that every day. Every day. That there can be beauty from pain when people are ready. St. John of the Cross, a Carmelite monk, 16th century Carmelite monk, speaking of the soul and the feminine, says this: the soul still sings in the darkness, telling of the beauty she found there, daring us not to think that because she endured such anguish and torture, she ran any more the danger of being lost in the night. Nay, in the darkness did she rather find herself. Maya Angelou. We have a duty as a community to start talking about death and grief. We have a duty to approach people who have endured such unimaginable pain and say to them, tell me your story. I will listen. I will not rush you. I will not medicalize that which cannot be medicalized. I will treat you with the compassion and dignity that you and your child or your spouse or your father or your mother or your other loved one so deserves. That's the beauty of being in a space of abysmal grief, is that you open yourself up to this incredible vulnerability and this incredible connectedness that comes from such vulnerability, this deep intimacy that transcends anything in the material world. She says, Maya Angelou says, I couldn't believe that a white man in the 16th century could so know my heart. If he could know my heart, a black woman in the 20th century, then I could know the heart of a Chinese Mandarin and a young Jewish boy in Brooklyn. If he could know me so, I alone bemoan my outcast state and curse my fate. She's speaking about William Shakespeare, who was a bereaved father. And his experience of suffering reached through the hands of time and touched her heart in such a way that he was a catalyst to her healing after not speaking for 5 years because of her own trauma and abuse. So I want to tell you about a little project that I started shortly after my own dark night of the soul in 1994. I knew that I couldn't take the money that was rightfully my daughter's for Christmas and spend it on my other children. I knew that I had to do something else more meaningful with the money that was rightfully hers. So I took that money and I bought some gifts for some underprivileged children, and I delivered those gifts. And I went to my car after I delivered the gifts and I cried. I cried because it was painful, and I also cried because it was beautiful. And then I thought to myself, how can I help other people engage with this? How can I help other people find a way to channel some of that grief and some of that pain into something, an act of remembrance, enacting love in the world because of their child who died. And so I created something called the Kindness Project, started in 1994, and since then we've distributed more than 2 million kindness projects have been done around the world. So I'll tell you a story. This is a little beautiful boy named Jared Michael Kennedy. Jared Michael's mom, I helped her after Jared died. He died of sudden infant death syndrome, and I helped her. And she decided that she wanted to give back, and she became a facilitator and a volunteer with our organization. She was having a hard day, and we teach self-care and compassion to our volunteers, and she was having a really hard day. It was coming up on the anniversary of Jared's death, which is hard for people. Anniversary dates are really painful. So she took herself to her favorite restaurant, Mimi's Cafe at 75th Avenue and Bell, for her favorite meal after a little retail therapy. So she had her little retail bag in hand, sitting at her favorite restaurant, eating her favorite meal, and in walks a large group of people, and they sit the large group of people right next to her, and it's a baby shower, which is always really painful for a woman who has had this tragic experience. And so what did Anna do? She said she could feel this anger rising in her for this pregnant woman, the stranger she didn't even know. And she wanted to turn to her at one point and say, "Save your receipts." So she calls me on the phone. She's crying. I can barely understand her. I said, take your time. She says, "You're not going to believe it. I was doing self-care. I went and I did exactly what you did, and then the baby shower." And I said, "Oh, no." And then she told me the thing about the receipts. I said, "Please said you tell me you did not say that." And she did not say that. Instead, she pulled out a Kindness Project card, and she wrote Jared Michael's name on it, and she paid for their bill and left. And about an hour later, I got an email that said, "To whom it may concern. Today, I was at Mimi's Cafe at 75th Avenue and Bell having my baby shower. At the end of our meal, a server came to us and handed us a card and told us that someone had paid our bill in memory of Jared. If you know who this lovely person is, would you please relay this message? Tell them that Jared Michael is an angel who touched our lives on October 20th, and we will never forget him. Sincerely, Ann Anderson." In that moment, Jared was very much alive. He was alive because of an act of love and an act of remembrance. And those are the small, glimmering coins at the bottom of the well of grief that some people throw away because they're terrified. There's a story, a Zen story, about a Chinese farmer who's going back to his home at the end of the day, and he's pursued by a tiger, and the tiger chases him up a tree, and he climbs up the tree, and he's terrified. Tiger's got all day. Tiger's just gonna wait there, and the branch starts to break, and he knows this is it, this is the end. And he looks up and he notices a strawberry vine growing around the branch of the tree, and he sees one red ripe strawberry, and he reaches up and he grabs the strawberry, and for the first time in his life, he tastes it. And this was an email from a student who took my traumatic death class, and for the first time in my life, I tasted the strawberry. I would like to close with a Maya Angelou poem, and I'd like to dedicate this to the families of Jacob and Katie and Zach and Charlotte and Ronan. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly. Our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. When great souls die, our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Our souls dependent upon their nature now shrink. Our minds formed and informed by their radiance falls away. We are not so much maddened as we are reduced to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly, slowly, and always irregularly still. Spaces fill, our senses restored, but they're never the same. They whisper to us, they existed, they existed. We can be, and we can be better because they existed. Thank you very much for your time.